Mastering is the process of getting the final mixed track ready for commercial release. When a track is mastered, it will be as loud and full as a commercially released song. Mastering is the final step in the production process. Once finished, the song is ready for distribution.
Hey everyone, welcome to the mastering portion of AIMS Virtual Open House. I'm Keith O'Neill, an instructional designer and instructor here at the school. During the mastering portion, we're going to be getting the track that Scott mixed ready for final distribution. Now that's going to involve a couple of different processes. One of the main things that you're going to see about a mastered track over just a mixed track is it's going to be a lot louder. So loudness is kind of a part of mastering, but a lot of people forget about the other steps that are involved. If you've ever worked on a track and you go listen to it in your car, you might realize it's not nearly as loud and as competitive as something that's maybe out there already on Spotify. So what we're gonna do is try and get that mixed track that Scott finished and get it ready. Now there's a lot of steps involved, but there's three main processes that you will use during a mastering, which is gonna be EQ, compression, and limiting. So to start off with, what I've done is I've taken the track that Scott finished and I brought it into a new Pro Tools session. Now, a lot of people try and maybe mix or master during the actual, or try and master during the actual mix, but we actually went ahead and created a completely separate session and we brought it into there for a few different reasons. So to start off with, I'm just going to highlight a portion of this to get it looping, and I'm gonna start off with one of the louder parts, which is gonna be the ending sort of outro chorus here. So what I'm gonna look at is a few different plugins that we're gonna actually start manipulating and messing with the sound. But one of the best things that you can do for a master is actually reference another track. So for this, I recommend a good plugin that's an analyzer that you can use to kind of reference other material. It kind of makes sense for this cover to use the original version of the song. So let me go ahead and get my talk back so you guys can hear me. Okay. I'm going to turn this down so I'm not too loud in your ears. And when I play this, you're going to see my track represented in blue and the reference track represented in orange. So this is showing me some loudness material. It's kind of, you can see obviously my track in blue is a lot lower than the reference track in orange. But I can also see frequency content with this spectrum analyzer. I can see phase correlation, which is gonna kind of tell me how well my mix translates to a mono playback source. I can look at the overall stereo image, again, of my track compared to the reference track, and even dynamic content. So this is gonna be a really good kind of method for comparing your track to an already commercially released song. And I can see, obviously, my track is a lot quieter compared to the original release, the reference track. I can definitely see that I've got, maybe I could use a little bit more low end down here, and it could be a little bit brighter. So let's go ahead and bring my playback back up for you guys. To start off with, I'm gonna use an EQ. So the first plugin I'm gonna use here is a Dangerous EQ, or it's from Dangerous, it's called the Bax EQ. This is a really popular EQ in mastering studios because it's very gentle. You're not doing like crazy changes with this. This essentially has a high shelf and a low shelf built into it, and all we're going to do in this, after noticing it with my reference, is I'm gonna maybe apply a little bit of sweetening in the low end and in the high end. So I've got two basic knobs. I've got the low shelf where I can set the frequency, and then I've got the decibels that I can add in or remove. The same thing for the high shelf. I can choose a frequency, and then I could add or remove frequencies and make them louder or quieter in that particular area. So what I always recommend when using an EQ, let the track play back, really crank the gain, turn up the frequency, or turn up the gain, the amplitude, and then just move the frequency slider here to see which frequencies that you really like and kind of appeal to your ears. Once you find something you like, maybe bring down the gain a little bit. Usually for mastering, we're not trying to add in a whole lot of amplitude with EQs, probably no more than about 3 decibels. If you find something you don't like, maybe you kind of back off of it a little bit and bring it down. But again, probably no more than a 3 decibel change. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let the track play back as I make some frequency adjustments. Cool, there we go. I just settled on a couple of different frequencies that I liked. I ended up boosting the highs and boosting the lows a little bit. It kind of gave it a little bit of body and kind of gave it a little bit of brightness that's gonna translate better to smaller playback sources. So what I'm gonna do is you'll see me doing this, I'm gonna be playing back and then I'll bypass the plugin to see really if, what that plugin did. Did it make it better? Do I like it with it, or did I make it worse? So let's see what that sounds like. Cool. So it made it a little bit fuller sounding. And again, the low end is gonna really help for a lot of people that are listening to music on their phones. You might need a little bit more body, a little bit more low end there. And the brightness is, you can kind of tell in the vocals maybe, and the cymbals that are kind of being accentuated. So that's gonna be our kind of main basic EQ there. Then we might move on to some form of compression. So at the school here, you're gonna learn about the different types of compression. First off, you're gonna learn just what compression does to the audio signal. And you learn a lot of that in the production and more so mixing side of things. In mastering, we're gonna be using different types of compressors. Oftentimes, we're not using a compressor to get a lot of gain reduction or really squash the sound. If you hear the compression during mastering, you've done too much, right? We're trying to use this more so like a gain-based processor. And there's different types of compressors out there. This one is specifically made for mastering, and it's a tube compressor. So by just passing the audio signal through this, it's probably gonna give me some warmth and some amplitude that I'm gonna like on this track. So all I'm gonna do here is manipulate the input to maybe give it some louder sound, make it a little bit louder, but also give it some body because it's passing through these tubes. Now, a lot of compressors are gonna give you different controls. You might see controls for like attack, release, maybe even threshold or ratio. If you do have a control for ratio, during mastering, you wanna keep that really low. It's very rare that I find myself going above a 2-to-1 ratio in mastering. If we go above that, you're gonna see maybe more gain reduction than you really like. Also, if you have attack times, which this one does, we don't want really fast attack times. If we have a really fast attack time, those drums are gonna come through and hit the actual compressor and they're gonna get squashed down, right? We like the dynamics of this track. It kind of builds into the chorus and everything. It kind of builds up and then it breaks down and then it gets louder again. We're not trying to kill that. We're trying to keep the dynamics of the song and we're trying to keep the percussive elements. If I have too fast of an attack, as soon as a snare or a kick gets above my threshold, it's gonna start compressing it. So when dealing with mastering, we typically want medium to slow attacks. Now the opposite is gonna be for release, which is going to be labeled as recovery in this. Release is how long it's gonna actually compress the signal. The longer release you have, the more noticeable it's going to be to the listener's ears. If you set this to a very slow release and I start getting gain reduction, it's gonna take a little bit of time for that to cycle back through and for the compression to stop. You can use that in a production sense, almost you get this pumping and breathing. You hear it in a lot of like EDM or pop songs. But for the master, we're trying to make what we do here be really transparent. We're not trying to stray from the mix completely. We're just trying to make sure that it's loud and competitive and gonna translate. So we want medium to fast releases if we ever get a release control. Some compressors you might see don't actually give you that. So just be aware of that. Also, the threshold on this is always, it's gonna default to be the maximum. So it's a fixed threshold. I can bring it down if I wanted to, but again, in this, I'm not trying to get a lot of gain reduction. These meters you see on the plugin will show me the amount of gain reduction I get. When you're using a compressor during mastering, try to not get more than 3 decibels of gain reduction. So I don't want this needle here to exceed about 3 there, okay? So this is a pretty simple process with this particular plugin because it just sounds good. All I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let the track play and I'm gonna give it some amplitude with the input. Okay, cool. So that actually did a few things. It actually, made it louder, obviously. It definitely got louder, but it also made it a little bit fuller. Depending on what you're listening back on, if you have some speakers, if you have a sub potentially, you could probably feel that getting a little bit more low end. And that's, again, just kind of the tubes. Now, this is a plugin. It's not a real hardware compressor, but it does a really good job at emulating the sound of the tubes that would be inside of that. Now, remember I said that there's 3 basic kind of plugins or processing that you want to do, maybe a little bit of EQ, a little bit of compression. Notice those 2 things I used, I didn't do crazy stuff on. And then you want to use a limiter, and the limiter should really be there not to add gain. Hopefully our limiter is there to just prevent clipping, and we'll look at that a little bit later. But after listening to this track, I think there's maybe some more additional EQ that I could do. So I'm going to dive into another process here, and I'm going to use an additional EQ, but this EQ is going to be a little bit more in-depth than the EQ we saw before. You're going to see a lot of knobs and a lot of things going on in this EQ, but the same principles really apply. It's just a lot more bands. If you remember in the other one, we only had 2 bands. We had highs and lows. In this one, I actually get 5 bands for both the left and the right. But this particular processor is a little bit different. It's set up in what we call mid-side. Mid-side is sometimes a really good tool to use during mastering, but you do have to be careful with it. What this does is this allows me to process things that are panned in the center of the stereo image versus things that are panned on the sides, and I can process them differently. There's some compressors that can operate in mid-side. There's some EQs like this one can operate in mid-side. So when I start manipulating the frequency content over here on the left side of this plugin, that's going to be in the mono section or the mid. That's going to be really affecting things that Scott panned in the center, which is usually kick, snare, vocals, things like that. Anything that he panned on the sides, like maybe some of those stereo overheads or those room mics he used on the drums, that's going to be affected by the EQ I do over here. So that's going to give me kind of some different sounds, and I can even almost manipulate the stereo image. I can make things sound wider or more narrow depending on what I do with a mid-side plugin. So for this one, I'm actually going to try and use it to maybe find things I don't like, okay? And you may be thinking, well, the track, Scott did a good job. He absolutely did a good job, but there's oftentimes just frequencies in there that you just can't really perceive. And this plugin does a really good job of highlighting those. You're going to notice as soon as I grab one of these knobs, it actually solos it. And what it does is it solos it and boosts it up really, really loud and makes it a very narrow boost. And that allows you to kind of use your ears to sweep the frequency back and forth and maybe find something that you don't like. I'll show you what I'm talking about. So notice there, as soon as I grabbed this frequency knob, it actually soloed that particular frequency that I was dialing into, and I was able to sweep it back and forth. And if I found something I kind of don't like maybe that hollow sort of sound, I can come up to the gain and bring it down a little bit. Now, the other thing I can do, because that's kind of a wide reduction I just did, I can narrow it up and maybe just kind of pinpoint a particular frequency. So I'm going to go through and do that here with the mid section and see if there's some frequencies I like, see if there's some things that I absolutely don't like. So in that upper frequency, that's going to be like a painful frequency. Your ears are going to be picking up frequencies differently. Your ears are actually really sensitive to some upper frequencies, particularly around the 4K sort of range. So usually there's some go-to frequencies you're gonna find me hitting when I go to master. Some things around 4K is gonna be kind of ear piercing, a little bit bright, and I usually try and pull some of that stuff down. And typically lower frequencies around the 250 hertz range tends to be where some hollow, muddy sounds tend to live. And so by just pulling those back a little bit, it's gonna clean it up. Now the other thing I'm gonna do just a little bit here is maybe another little bit of a bass boost in the low end, in the mid though. Notice I'm doing this only on the mid section. You kind of want to try and avoid low frequencies in the sides. If you have a lot of low frequencies, a lot of people mix kicks with 808s and stuff like that, keep those panned in the center. If you have those out wide and really big and stereo sounding, yeah, it kind of sounds good while you're mixing. The bad part about that is you're fighting another battle. Your mix is not going to translate well to other playback sources. When that song is distributed, when it gets released, a lot of people might listen back to that in a mono environment. Maybe a lot of cell phones are mono. Every restaurant, every commercial, store that you go to, they're gonna be playing back that track in mono. And if you have these really wide, low frequencies, they'll actually get lost when it gets converted to mono. So what we have to be careful of is having a lot of low end in the sides. And I can really kind of fix that by using a low pass filter or a high pass filter on my side section. So I'm gonna engage that and bring it up a little bit. Let's make it a little bit steeper. And if I want to in this, I could even maybe boost the highs and give it a little bit of a presence shift over in the sides. The other thing that this tool has from Brainworks, this is a really good tool they built into a lot of their plugins, is what they call a mono maker. If I turn this up to, let's say, 170 hertz, what this does is it takes everything below that frequency and pulls it into the center channel. So then it's affected by this EQ. So let's see what this plugin's doing. I'm gonna bypass it, listen to it, and then bring it back in. Now, it may be subtle. It may sound like there's not a big change there, but to me, it's a noticeable change. There's a lot of clarity and stuff that was kind of brought to the forefront in that track. And that's also part of mastering, is having like really good tuned ears. I also have like a really nice monitoring system in here that I can hear these frequencies. So the next thing I'm gonna go to is actually maybe a little bit more compression. And in this sense, I'm not necessarily using a compressor just to add some gain. Maybe I want to use a compressor to reduce the dynamic range. So this compressor here is, it's a plugin. It's called the API 2500, and this is a type of VCA compressor. A VCA compressor is by far the most common type of compressor, and it's very clean and very transparent. It's gonna be a good tool to use to maybe get some compression. Here, I'm not necessarily using a tube compressor because I'm not trying to warm it up any. I think it's plenty warm. I'm just here maybe to try and keep some of those peaks and stuff in check a little bit. But again, the same rules apply. We don't wanna use high ratios, so we want to reduce our ratio down. We don't want to use very fast attacks, and we don't want to use very slow releases. Now this plugin defaults typically to a lot of compression, where the threshold, I typically have to back off of it. So you're gonna see as soon as I initiate playback, I may have to reduce the threshold to reduce the amount of gain reduction I'm getting. Okay, so all that does is it kind of keeps everything in check a little bit. It kind of keeps the waveform more solid and kind of prevents things from slipping out and getting a little bit too bright and a little bit past our compressor and then hit our limiter, which ends up getting squashed. The other thing that this plugin has, which a lot of compressor has, is it has a high-pass sidechain filter. It was actually something that was in this tube compressor that I left off, but it's right here. Now, a lot of people hear about sidechain and they use it in a production sense. Sidechain is simply sending an alternate input signal into typically a compressor, but usually into any dynamics-based processor. What this is, a high-pass sidechain, is it's going to roll off the low frequencies, kind of like a high-pass filter, but it's only rolling off the low frequencies that the compressor is looking at. In other words, it's not going to affect what you hear, but it's going to affect the frequencies that the compressor is compressing. So we're going to see that right here. They call it the thrust circuit, the detector circuit. You can see it's almost got this kind of symbol almost representing a high-pass filter there. And if you look at the frequency content, you're always going to see a lot more low end. That's because, again, your ears perceive frequencies differently. We can't hear low end as well as we can hear a high end. So we're going to have a lot more low end in tracks volume-wise than we do kind of the high end. If that low end is just amplitude-wise a lot louder, it's going to hit your compressor and get compressed easier, right? Because it's going to hit your threshold, it's going to hit that compressor, and you may get more gain reduction than you really intend. So it's a really good practice to maybe engage the high-pass sidechain anytime you're using a compressor in mastering. So I'm going to do that by just setting this detector circuit probably to loud. Now this one also has a knee control. Now, you're typically going to see two kind of schools of thought about this, like a soft knee or a hard knee. A hard knee means that when the sound hits your compressor, it's going to just immediately start compressing it. A soft knee means it's going to compress it only when the sound is much, much louder than the threshold. So it's gradually applying the compression. The best way to think about this, a soft knee makes your gain reduction less noticeable and less obvious, which is obviously something we want while we're mastering. We don't really want to hear a lot of gain reduction. So I'm going to leave this towards a softer knee. And then this one does have an output gain, right? So I could adjust that. While I do that, I'm going to also bring up my analyzer plugin here and kind of see where we're at on the loudness compared to my reference track. Okay, so I'm going to let this track play. I'm going to dial in some settings here with this compressor, and then I'm going to kind of see where we're at in the loudness levels. All right, so you can see with the frequency content and with the loudness, I'm much closer to my reference track. Now the last little bit, and you might see that I'm clipping here, and that's because I need a limiter. You have to have a limiter on your tracks to prevent clipping. And I'm gonna be using the FabFilter Pro L2 here. It's a really good mastering limiter. And when we're using this plugin for mastering, I need to turn on this oversampling. What that's going to do is it's going to take the audio inputted into it and in this case double the sample rate, so that way it's a lot more accurate. One thing that I'm also doing here as to why I've opened up a completely new session, why don't I just put these on my master fader while I'm mixing? Well, all of these plugins that I've used are designed for mastering. They're not plugins that you would use during a normal mix scenario. And that's for a few different reasons. They're all high quality, algorithms that are processing your audio, and they are extremely processor intensive. They will bog down your CPU like crazy. So that's one reason we're gonna open this up in a completely separate session, so we're freeing up a lot of processing power. The other thing is we are mastering already at a higher sample rate. So this session that I'm working at is at 96 kilohertz. Right, so Scott was doing his tracking and his mixing at a 48 kilohertz session, which is pretty standard. That's actually the recommended standard for tracking and mixing. But when I go to master, I'm going to be bringing this into a new session at a much higher sample rate to allow these plugins a little bit more ones and zeros to really operate on and give me that accuracy. One thing that we're going to talk about once I finish, though, is I can't release this track at this high sample rate. I'm going to have to reduce it down. So before we get there, I need to put this limiter on to make sure that I'm not going to clip. If your track clips, it can't be distributed. There's a lot of distribution services like Apple Music and Spotify that will reject a track if it's clipping. So how do we prevent it from clipping? On our limiter, we're going to set the output ceiling. Now, there's a few different schools of thought with this. Some people back in the day, we would actually maybe put our output ceiling to maybe negative 0.2, negative 0.3. So that way we can get super close to clipping, which is 0, but we're not going to clip, right? That's not the case anymore. It was the case if we all listened to CDs, but most of us don't burn CDs or listen to CDs at all. We are listening to music through a streaming service more often than not. We might be going to Spotify or YouTube or Apple Music or Tidal to listen to a track. The music that we get from Apple Music and Tidal and Spotify, all these different distribution networks, they're all different file types. And in fact, we're going to take this track when we're done mastering it and have to reduce it down. So that makes our job as a mastering engineer even more difficult, right? We got to get the track loud, get it, to where it's really sounding good, and get it to where it'll sound good everywhere, not just in a studio, but sound good off of your cell phone. And we have to downgrade the crap out of the quality, right? That's kind of the job of mastering. So we can't set our output ceilings to negative 0.2 because once we get the file converted to what Spotify will play it back as, or which is an OGG file, or to Apple Music, which is an AAC file, which is the same as YouTube, that output ceiling, the peak level of your audio, will actually increase. So what we have to do in modern day mastering is we need to set our output levels at a full negative 1 decibel. And that's going to prevent clipping whenever this file is eventually converted down to another file type and reconverted and then streamed, right? That's going to prevent that clipping. This plugin also has something else built into it, which is called true peak limiting. And that's what true peaks are. True peaks are when the file is converted, to a different file type and then finally converted from a file back to an analog medium as you listen to it, maybe through your headphones. We have to prevent clipping that whole way. So giving ourselves a full decibel worth of headroom is going to allow that. Now, most limiters will also give you a gain, sometimes just labeled as a threshold knob here, but we also kind of want to be monitoring the loudness, right? We need to see how loud we're actually being at this point. Now, we're not actually trying to get as loud as our reference. Don't do that. You're going to end up squashing your track. What happens whenever you listen back to a track through a streaming service, your track is normalized. In other words, it's turned up or down to fall in the same loudness level with other tracks, because very few people are listening to entire albums or even the same artist back to back. So what's going to happen is you're going to listen to maybe a David Bowie track and it's going to be followed by a Skrillex track, and they're going to be entirely different levels. So what these distribution networks have done is they've normalized our audio. In other words, they made it all the same relative volume. And they use a normalization standard called LUFS. LUFS is kind of a broadcast way of measuring loudness, but now it's been adopted into the music realm because that's what these streaming services are using to normalize and volume out things. So when I start playing this, you're going to see that this is telling me the short-term loudness level, which is giving me the loudness level over the last 3 seconds. What I would recommend to maintain the dynamics of your track and not squash it too much is try and get your short-term loudness level to be probably around or at least -10 during the loudest part of your track. And so that's why I started off here by looping out that last chorus. That's when all the instruments and everything is going to be there, and that's going to be the loudest part of my track. So I've got that looping out, and it's going to be giving me a good overall loudness. So we want to try and get the short-term loudness, or the short-term LUFS, over the loudest part to be at least -10. I would say between -10 to -9 or maybe -8, depending on the style of the track. If it's a really like hyped up dance EDM track, maybe you might shoot for that -8. Now, the reason being is when your file is distributed, it's going to be turned up or down based upon the corresponding streaming services loudness normalization. So we're not trying to squash it so much because it's already going to be turned up or down. So we're fighting the loudness war. So we're trying to maintain the dynamics of our track. So let's see where we're sitting at. Okay, so I had to maybe add in a little bit of gain there on my limiter, but that's not bad. Oftentimes you might go back to maybe some of your other processors. Don't forget about your signal chain. Maybe I could go back and turn up the output gain of this compressor. Maybe I could go and affect the gain of this particular compressor or of this EQ, right? You have to kind of keep in mind the order of operations in your signal chain. The output gain of, or the output level of this particular EQ that's first is really affecting the input of what's behind it. The output of this is affecting the input of this EQ, right? And so on and so forth. But now that we've got our track loud and competitive frequency-wise and loudness-wise, I think we're ready to get it ready for distribution. The next thing I'm gonna do just to kind of, button things up, I'm gonna put a really tiny fade in at the very beginning and a really small fade out at the very end. Now, oftentimes mix engineers will incorporate a fade out at the end of the track just right into their mixing. That used to be reserved for mastering, but these are such small fade ins and fade outs that you probably won't audibly hear them, but we've added in a lot of volume and a lot of noise, potentially with some of these plugins. We don't want an abrupt spike in audio. So that's why I've kind of done a little bit of a fade in and a little bit of a fade out. And then I can go through and bounce this track out. Now, when I go to bounce this track out, I am going to keep the resolution original. I'm going to bounce it out at 96K 24-bit. I'm also going to make sure it's a full resolution WAV file and it's interleaved. This bounced out version, this would be the high quality version. Some platforms allow you to distribute this high quality version of this. And Apple Music is one of them. You can distribute and submit to Apple Music a 96K 24-bit file, and what they will do is reduce it down to their AAC version that can be used for streaming and downloading. And by starting off with that much higher quality file, they can get a lot more information there than just giving them the regular old CD version. But some distribution services don't take the high quality version and they need the CD version. And so in order to do that, we're gonna go into another piece of software here. I'm gonna bring it into a piece of software called RX from iZotope. Now the reason I'm bringing it into here is I need to take this high quality file, the 96K 24-bit file, and I need to reduce the sample rate and the bit depth down. We always talk about a CD quality version or a CD version of a track, even though we're not necessarily probably referring to, a physical CD. The CD version is going to be 44.1 kilohertz as the sample rate and 16-bit. That 44.1 16-bit version is what would then be distributed to Spotify. That's what Tidal would use to convert to a FLAC file. That's what a lot of distribution networks actually use. So to get this file down, I'm bringing it into a different software application. Could I bounce out of Pro Tools at 44.1 and call it a day? Sure. But the sample rate conversion of Pro Tools is not as good as the sample rate conversion of RX. iZotope makes a really great quality sample rate converter, and so that's why we're using this. I'm gonna go over here to my utilities and go to the resample. And what I'm going to do is set the new sample rate to 44.1. Then hit process. And now my file is all the way down at 44.1, but that's not the final step. I have to get it down to 16-bit in order for it to be distributed. So what's going to happen is we're going from 24 bits of the original file down to 16. We're losing 8 bits of the audio. When you do that, you can sometimes get some weird noises and some weird distortion. So there's a process that we're going to do which kind of covers up that noise, and it's known as dither. So we're going to go over here and add on dither, and we're going to set our outgoing bit depth as 16. And now this file, I can export it, and it's ready for distribution. So now that we've gotten our track mastered, and we've gotten it 2 versions really. We have the high quality version, which is 96K 24-bit, and then we have the CD version, which is 44.1 24-bit. Those are going to be the 2 versions that we can send to what's called an aggregator. An aggregator is somebody that's going to get your music distributed to the streaming networks. Somebody like TuneCore, CD Baby, DistroKid, those are some of the more popular aggregators, and they will take that file and get it distributed for you. So that's pretty much the whole mastering process. For students here at the school, if you're a music and technology student, it's a great skill to really know to get your own music mastered and get it ready for distribution. For music production students, we're going to take this class to kind of learn how we can be a mastering engineer and work with additional clients and kind of open up our resume for additional work. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I really want to thank you for attending Atlanta Institute of Music and Media's first virtual open house. If you guys want more information about the school or the programs that we offer here, please go to www.aimm.edu.